it's obvious in the world, victim mentality is on the rise. And there are a number of reasons for this, but I've been called a storm chaser, and just bear with me for a second. The storms are not tsunamis or hurricanes or twisters; they are storms of the human mind. And in 2004, I predicted the opiate crisis when I was on Oprah. I was talking about this problem that I saw coming, and 10 years later, 5 to 10 years later, it exploded, along with the prescription drug crisis. Now I see two things happening. I see this victim mentality taking over, especially a lot of younger people, whereby it's going to have significant impact on the lens by which they see the world. And that really freaks me out, and it really scares me. And the second thing is this epidemic of conformity that we find ourselves in, where there's less focus on original thinking and creativity, because there's more groupthink, there's more validation seeking, there's more impression management out there. So in regards to, victim status, if you look at, if everyone's a victim, no one's a victim. That's the first thing. And I think people are utilizing victim status to differentiate. Now, part of that is social media. Part of it is, I want to be seen. I want to be looked at as different. I want more attention. The definition of victim, and in this case, I would say self-victimization, because victimization is another person becoming a victim. You either were the perpetrator or you were part of that. So let's call it self-victimization, which essentially is victim coming from a state of weakness, is the action of declaring yourself a victim of cruel or unjust treatment, and enduring trauma and suffering in the process. Vulnerability comes from a state of strength. It's a willingness to show emotion, a willingness to allow one's weakness to be seen or known, or to risk being emotionally hurt, because you are coming from a place of strength to express yourself, to share a message, to follow your passion, to follow your purpose. And you're willing to take that risk from a place of strength in order to put that message out there. These two could not be more polar opposites. Yet people are saying, yes, I'm a victim, I'm a victim, I'm a victim. And they think they're going to gain strength from that. They are not going to gain strength from that. There's even a cycle that I talk about quite a bit, from victim to vulnerability. And victim is the beginning of the cycle. If you have been victimized, it's okay to feel angry, to protest, to be upset, because you're just coming into awareness of the victim status that you have, and you want to tell people about it, or you believe in a movement. We've seen all these movements that are happening. That's okay, but you can't get stuck in that victim status. You move through this cycle and eventually get to a state of vulnerability where you can take action on your feelings internally of being the victim at one point in time.
You said something a minute ago that you're not going to get strength from being a victim. That there's a confusion around that. People think they're going to get something of value from being a victim, and therefore are relating to the world through that victim sort of mindset, and almost virtue signaling, though virtue is not the right word, but trait signaling, I guess you could say. Hey, I'm a victim. Where some people are advertising to the world, but I would almost, it's not that I disagree with you, but I want to push back on the way you said it, because in some way, these people are actually getting something from the world, in some cases, in the current culture, by relating as a victim, because there is a group of people in the current culture that is wanting to praise or give value to people who are of this sort of in this victim mindset in many cases, and say, how brave of you to acknowledge, your victimhood. And I'm also finding that there's a culture around trauma right now where a lot of people have become kind of obsessed with their own traumas, and in many cases are kind of retelling the story of their life, really emphasizing what I would consider oftentimes pretty normal things, um, and framing them as traumas or as micro traumas, as framing them as these really bad things, and then framing trauma as something that is like a lifelong scar, this thing that harmed you and is forever harming you, and you carry with you, and it's forever like limiting you. I think that there's a dominant narrative around trauma that is framing things that way right now. Would you agree with me or disagree with me on that?
Yeah, so there's two things you're talking about. Let's talk about the trauma one first.
Okay.
100% I agree with you that first off, there are varying degrees of trauma. Trauma, the most significant trauma ever to one person can be absolutely debilitating, and unless they get true professional help to process that trauma, which could take their whole life if it was a really significant severe trauma, that could just wipe out somebody. Whereas that same significant trauma in somebody else may not present as a really challenging event to them. It could be bad, it could be something they endured, but their coping skills were different. The baseline by which they see the world is different. Their support network is different. The capabilities that they came in with from a psychological perspective and their foundation were different. So from a trauma perspective, I do see more and more people, as you suggested, that see trauma as a lifelong scar, that use trauma in telling their story, which is fine, as long as you keep moving to go past the trauma. The trauma is not going to be something you just forget, but it's something that doesn't have to contain the same emotional value from a negative perspective throughout your life that you started with. Our scars don't have to dictate our future. And so when we look at trauma being advertised, I like the idea that people are more willing to communicate and talk about their trauma, because it's a way of expelling it. It's a way of moving it through you and processing it. However, if you get stuck in your trauma and you define yourself by your trauma and you identify as your trauma, the individual you are, not the person who suffered from this trauma, but you have become the trauma, that's a real problem. And that's why, my background, one of the things I do is I was trained as a humanistic psychiatrist. And I say humanistic because no, it's not about just prescribing pills. There is a philosophical end to what I do and an existential end to what I do. And part of that is I am not, I tell clients when I used to own a treatment center and in mental health and personal growth. And I would tell people, no, you are not an anxiety patient. You are not bipolar. You are not depressed. You are not OCD. You are not ADHD. You are an individual. You are Bob. You have an entire aura, an entire energy, an entire person that you are, who happens to be suffering from these symptoms. The constellation of these symptoms make up this diagnosis of ADHD. And there are many elements to how you move past this ADHD. So it's very important when you look at identification. And now to get to the first thing that we were talking about, which is this sense of victim mindset. And I'm not saying don't be a victim. Don't portray the anger, the protest, the sorrow, the worry. I'm not denouncing being a victim by any sense of the imagination. What I am saying is that victim is the first step in a cycle. You move from victim to vulnerability. And I don't want people to get stuck in a sense of victim mentality by which they then identify as a victim throughout their life, to the point where they start to see the world through the lens of someone who is a victim, because then the world becomes a much more narrow, limiting, negative place, whereby Look, if you look at some of the studies out there in the research studies on victim mentality, it's one of the primary reasons why people have a poor sense of well-being. The research is pretty clear on it, that when you're stuck in a victimization stance or mindset, you're not promoting well-being. You can't forgive. You have a hard time with forgiveness. You personalize everything. You ruminate. You have intrusive information. You become unhappy, and those around you don't like to be around you because of it. Yeah, and the last thing I'll say on this is that there's many reasons that you can be and stay stuck in a victim mentality. I mean, first off, when you are a victim, there's, some people are victims. Let me just say, I want to think the best of people. So when someone is in a victim stance, and by the way, negativity is part of being human. To endure pain is part of being human. You, me, name a person out there, we have all suffered. We all have the potential to be victims. I'm sure you've got a story where you were a victim. I've got lots of stories being a brown-skinned Muslim guy in the US when that's not really the popular way to be. I've been, discriminated against all the time, bullied, all sorts of stuff. Southwest Airlines has, my last name is Karim. Karim is like Bob in the world. And Southwest Airlines has my name on a watch list, the last name, which is like putting the name Joe or Bob on a watch list. So I have to go like an hour early just to go to the airport, an hour earlier than everybody else, because I don't know what's going to happen randomly when there's selection processes. Everyone's got some kind of a story. Now, some are really terrible tragedies of bullying and other things, and some maybe are not so much. But when you're in that victim stance, some people get lost in it, and it becomes a form of escapism from doing and activating other aspects of who they are. Some people go and stay in victim status because of community building, because you do enter a community of other people that feel the same way, and that's a good thing. That is not a bad thing. For some people, the victim status creates an expressive outlet for them, and it's a way to say, hey, this thing happened to me, and that's fine. However, you can't stay stuck in that. That is the biggest thing that I want to get out there.
Do you see that there's a culture right now that's being reinforced that essentially praises the victim, that almost where people get social validation from being victimized, being part of a group that is victimized, that is a group that is oppressed in some way? I mean, I see in the young generation, in the young, especially the teenagers that I know, like family, nieces and nephews and things like that, that it is almost a constant obsession with the various ways that they're being oppressed or victimized in some way. And I know Jonathan Haidt has talked about this, and specifically why young girls today are so prone to depression, as a form of essentially negative CBT is how he calls it. I don't know if you've seen that, but negative cognitive behavioral therapy. It's essentially the opposite of cognitive behavioral therapy. It is training people to think in negative ways instead of positive ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought that up. I am familiar with it. It goes back to what I was talking about, but the lens by which you see the world. So let's try to kind of break it down. First, you've got a culture that is raised on social media, and in that culture, there is social comparison, there is validation seeking, there is wanting desperately to stand out, to be seen, to be heard, to be accepted, to be validated, and in doing so, there's this promotion, as you said, this reward of victim status as a way of being distinctive. as a way of differentiation, as a way of gaining support, of gaining praise, of gaining some type of social validation and social reward. Okay, so now you've been rewarded for your victim status. Because you've been rewarded by that victim status, you start to identify as the victim status. You don't just suddenly go, okay, that's great. I was a victim then, and now I'm not a victim anymore. Cool. No, the socialization is kicked in. So now you start to identify and build a foundation with this victim status. And in the victim status, there's always the oppressor, the perpetrators, the ones who have done this to me. And forgiveness is such a huge part of that. You need to, the true victims, you forgive yourself and say, look, there was nothing I could do about this. There has to be self-forgiveness, and it's usually healthy, maybe not in all circumstances, but in a lot of circumstances, to eventually forgive the person, people, or group that was a part of that, for your own health, for your own mental health. If there's no forgiveness, and the lens by which you see the world is a negative place where you're angry and you're upset by this whole thing, even if you're getting social reward, you're still coming from a place of anger and negativity. That's what Jonathan was talking about with this negative CBT. You are training your mind to look at the world with negativity. And that cognitive behavioral effect then is, eventually you train to develop permanence in how you see the world. Now, when you're looking at the world in a negative state, as I mentioned with well-being and the research on well-being, the world becomes a scary, dark, negative place. And you become more angry, and you become more impulsive, and you become more difficult to deal with. And there's more rage, and there's less ability to attract positivity, attract opportunities, attract deep relationships, because you're in that state. And then all sorts of things kick in: depression, worry, loneliness, all that stuff kicks in after that, and it just spirals.
There might be some people who are listening to this and maybe thinking that we're making a sort of traditionalist, almost patriarchal sort of argument in favor of mental strength over mental weakness, for example. I could see some people interpreting things in that way. My response to that would be essentially like, well, we have to have some universal agreement about what we're actually concerned about. And I think human happiness, human flourishing, the extent to which people are depressed would be a probably, or have anxiety or other mental health problems, would probably be a good measure that we could objectively agree upon, like to say, well, here's these people with these kinds of mindsets, and here are their propensity for depression or for anxiety, for other mental illness, and here's these people over here with other mindsets, and here's their propensity. So the argument that Jonathan Haidt makes is essentially, hey, young girls who have these kinds of ways of thinking, who are popular, are extremely prone to becoming depressed. That's kind of how I would respond. I'm just wondering how you would respond to maybe somebody who's criticizing our way of talking about this issue right now.
Well, I'll tell you where these ideas came from for me. They came from the treatment center I was running. When I look at mental health, the way I was trained at a very high-end, world-renowned institute, UCLA, the Institute for Neuroscience, and a number of things. I had great training, and I felt like something was missing in that training, but I couldn't really figure it out. But it was great biological training, great therapeutic training. And when I opened a treatment center, I took some of the best providers and best clinicians I knew to develop an integrative program where somebody would come in for a mental health problem or some kind of crisis, and we would do crisis management, move them towards stabilization. Some of that was, psychopharmacology. A lot of it was therapeutic measures, whether it was, family of origin work or cognitive behavioral or dialectical behavioral, or we even did some energy work and Chinese medicine and a number of things, nutritional work, all of that, to get them to a point of stabilization. And then, because insurance companies don't cover anything beyond stabilization, and most people have been trained in their mind to not focus on anything else once they're stable from a therapy perspective or a treatment perspective. And I don't mean therapy like once a week. I mean like coming in on a regular, like an intensive therapy. People would go home and maybe they'd go see their therapist once a week or something, but there was no more intensiveness to it. And, we would consult with people, we would talk to those clients and those patients, and they would be like, I feel fine. I mean, I feel okay, but I'm coming back to the same environment. I'm coming back to the same pressures. I'm coming back to the same work. I'm coming back to the same fill in the blanks. And so I said, I want to try to do something different here. I want to develop a program. You could call it an aftercare program. You could call it an extension. You could call it whatever you want to call it. But in that program, I want to completely focus on existentialism, identity formation, creative vision, to be able to see beyond your current circumstances. And that's part of, the moving out of a victim mentality. And I'm not, in any way denigrating victim, because it's something we all go through. It's that if you stay in victim, it's going to impact your mental health.
Yeah.
Yes, there are benefits of community. There are benefits of socialization. There's benefits of expression. There's many benefits initially to let out that emotion, to let out that anger, that feeling you have about having something done to you, or the injustice that occurred to you. That is very important, but don't get stuck there.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. And I've seen it play out. And when we put that extra program in, that aftercare program, we had phenomenal results. When I talk to those same clients, they'd be like, yeah, I just feel like I have more of a foundation. I have more of a belief system. I can see more potential opportunities that I can go. They have more confidence. They had more connection to who they are in a deeper way. And I call it more, they enhanced their cognitive flexibility. There was more soulful expression and connection in this disconnected society to who they really are originally. And that gave them the confidence to go do the stuff that they wanted to do, instead of just kind of letting the environment and for some of them, negative environment, dictate who they should be and what they should do.
I'm curious, what is some of the science that you've learned around facilitating new habit formation and facilitating behavioral change? What kind of fields of research have you dug into, and what were some of the key findings around those topics?
Yeah, so if we're looking at habits, and first of all, why habits? And that would be because if you look at health and energy, and so if someone is fatigued or they're having health issues, it's probably not, in some cases it could be just like an acute sudden thing happened to them, but a lot of times it's things that have been happening over the past months to years have compounded. Behaviors, that could be the light exposure, their circadian rhythms getting thrown off, all these things. It's usually a result of habits, right? What you're experiencing today. So that is the core area that I focus on. And so if you go something like Charles Duhigg, Power of Habit, he talks about the 3 phases of the habit cycle. There's the cue, the routine, and the reward. So if you break that down, then you can go, okay, how can we shift any one of these things in order to change habits? And so probably the simplest thing, I don't know if I'd say it's the easiest shift, but one of the most powerful shifts if you want to change your habits is, people think it's about willpower. Some people think it's just willpower. I got to have more discipline or willpower. And I think it was Yogananda has this quote: environment is stronger than willpower. So it's common sense if you think about it, that it's like you start with the environment that will affect your behavior. So if you change the cue, which is some sort of trigger in your environment, maybe it's a time of day, maybe it's someone sees, they see cookies and they smell the cookies and they're like, now I want cookies. They didn't 5 minutes before, but as soon as there's that cue, that's what triggers the desire. Well, virtually all your habits have some sort of cue associated with them. So breaking a bad habit is that you could remove that cue, or bringing in a good habit is what can you put in your environment that makes that habit almost effortless or automatic.
Mm-hmm.
So, someone wants to, just a real simple example, someone wants to eat more fruits or vegetables, put it in plain sight, bring it to the front of the refrigerator even. Make that easy to access. Someone wants to cut out some of the junk food, remove it from the house, or some people just put it in a cupboard that they don't go into. Or I got a family. Okay, we'll create a separate system if necessary. And I know it's not always practical, but like whatever you can do to separate your, shift the environment. So you're not seeing it, you're not hearing about it, you're not having these things that are coming in and triggering you as a cue to engage in the habit. So that's one piece. Second piece is the routine, and that's the habit itself. So you could have the same cue, but you substitute. So instead of thinking I got to change my whole diet, a lot of times I'm like, what can you just swap out? So what do you normally have, and what's a better option? So that's diet, or it can be exercise. We could go into sleep. So, I'll leave it up to you if you want to cover certain areas around health and how we can apply it to that. But the idea, probably the easiest one to explain, is I don't teach people like start a whole new diet. I go, what are you currently having at that time of day? What's pretty close? And you can swap it out. So if they're having candy, okay, some raw cacao and nuts or something like that might be, it's easy, it's convenient, maybe a similar kind of texture that they can do that. And I'm like, let's start there, because is it perfect? That's not the concern. It's what's just a real easy substitution so that it takes almost no effort or willpower to just instantly swap that out.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, there's the reward, and that is for all things to become habits, there has to be some, that dopamine release, that sense of like, oh yeah, good job. I'm happy about this. And we could dive deeper into that too. But for now, just covering the overview, that means feeling a sense of self-acknowledgement for even the littlest things that you do. So I'll give an example. Like working, I hear examples of this. Like I went to the gym today and I exercised, but I could only go for 30 minutes and then I didn't feel that good. And so many people, like my friends, they're in such better shape than I am. And so they're like beating it. I'm like, no, that's a win. You got to acknowledge that. You got to own that, because as long as they're going, yeah, but I could have done better. Yeah, but that will not reinforce it as a habit. So it's actually starting even just your own internal self-talk to go, oh, that's good. I ate one piece of celery today. Okay, that's a step in the right direction. Nice job, right? And that ability to acknowledge yourself is so key, because that's what's going to reinforce it and make something an ongoing habit.
I want to kind of dig into some nuances there for just a second. You said, let's say somebody takes, has a stick of celery on that day, and you say, good job, that's a step in the right direction. What if it's in the context of they normally have 5 sticks of celery, and they normally have, 3 salads, and, they ate a bunch of McDonald's, and this is probably an exaggeration of what might actually occur, but let's say they binged on McDonald's and did skip their 2 normal daily portions of salad and 4 of the 5 pieces of celery, but they did have 1 piece of celery. Should they be rewarding themselves? Should they be patting themselves on the back in that scenario? I mean, what is the appropriate sort of way of rewarding oneself in a context like that?
Yeah, so that's a great point. And that is, okay, well, was this actually a step in the right direction, or was it a step backwards? And that's going to depend, what is their usual habit, right? So if they're usually, eating a bunch of vegetables or whatever, but today they regressed, they went backwards to only 1 stick and eating a bunch of junk. What I found, and it's going to vary based off the individual, most people will take the I'm going to beat myself up for all my failures approach. And that can kind of work very short term, but it's not typically what actually creates the habit, because you do need the reward. So sometimes actually looking for the one little good thing that you did can actually be helpful. And this actually, I'll jump away from health for a moment to just show you how this applies in different contexts. Like a manager or a boss at a job, the tendency is, oh, my employee, I'm going to talk about all the things that they did wrong. Oh, you didn't get this in on time. This isn't good, whatever. When you study human behavior and performance, a lot of people will actually do better if you can find the one little thing that they did right and praise that and try to set them up for success, because success breeds success. So I'm not saying there isn't a place for discipline or to say, hey, look, that wasn't that good. You know, step it up. At the same time, though, there is something to go, okay, what went well? What worked? And finding even the smallest little thing and then acknowledging that. So yeah, you know what? It wasn't a perfect day, but I did have that one piece of celery. That's good. Mm-hmm. Then the next part, we want growth though. We want improvement. So a great question is, well, what could I do even better? So it's always focused on the future.
Do you mind if I interrupt you for just a minute before we get there? I want to add, you just triggered a memory of mine from actually many years ago, some research that I read around something called the healthy obsession model. And in the context of weight loss, and specifically there were some researchers looking at, they were looking at the traits, the personality and behavioral traits or the psychological and behavioral traits of successful weight loss achievers versus non-successful weight loss achievers. And they were specifically likening the traits of successful weight loss achievers to those of an athlete, of a high-level athlete, of a committed athlete. And there were several aspects of this. It's pretty fascinating research, actually. I used to have some presentations that I would kind of lecture on the details of this research. But they identified several specific traits that kind of made successful weight loss achievers similar to high-level athletes in their, for example, kind of their mental toughness, their ability to tolerate physical discomfort and kind of push through those, whether it's the physical discomfort of hard training and soreness, or the physical discomfort of hunger pangs and cravings and so on. But one of the traits that is a bit counterintuitive that they had identified, and you kind of alluded to this in passing, is counterintuitively, the successful weight loss achievers actually have a stronger negative emotional reaction to deviations from the optimal plan. Now, I think the context is really important here. And basically what this means is, you know, let's say they're doing really good with their habits, eating what they're supposed to be eating, sticking to the plan, exercising, sleeping well, taking care of meditating, taking care of their stress levels and so on. Everything's really dialed in. And then one day, all hell breaks loose. Everything goes down the crapper, and, they binge and they feel lazy and they just feel like sitting around watching Netflix all day. Well, the ones who are successful have a negative reaction, a stronger negative emotional reaction to that, where they go, this is out of control. I need to get myself back on track. This is unacceptable. Tomorrow I'm starting, I'm doing things right. Whereas a lot of the people who are less successful basically just kind of go, screw it. I've already failed. I might as well just keep failing. I might as well just forget about that whole thing that I was trying to achieve. So anyway, I just thought I'd add that. Obviously context matters, such that, if somebody is not doing the right habits, frequently, and then they have a deviation to it, one's reaction to that would be different than if they are doing the right habits most of the time. But I just thought I would interject that here as being relevant to that discussion.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up. So I'll touch back on where I was going in a moment. But on that point, that's what I've noticed is like there's a standard that you have for yourself. And I feel like athletes and people, there's like this sort of self-standard of I know what I'm capable of. I know who I am. This is way out of that. And it's that incongruence. It's like, oh, I can't let myself be like a lazy slob all the time or whatever. Right. And that negative feeling. So I also want to make a point of nuance. I'm not saying it's all got to be sunshine and rainbows and positive. Negative motivation tends to be stronger for human beings. Avoidance of pain, avoidance of like, ooh, I don't want to go down that path, can be stronger. What sustains tends to be a sense of constant feeling of positive, like, oh, I feel good when I exercise. I like that I exercise. Like what gets me going to the gym is not avoiding getting out of shape. That's not what's kept me in the gym for 15 years. If I were to not go to the gym for a week or two though, or exercise at all, I start to get like, this isn't me. I feel like I want to like, you get like this itch, like this is not who I am, right? That identity. So what keeps the person going tends to be like a almost identity based or congruence with who they feel they are and not wanting to divert from that. I'll make a note. I'm glad you brought up athletes because this has been my observation. I don't have research off the top of my head. This is more anecdotal, is that like I do Brazilian jiu-jitsu. So when I first get started and when someone's first learning something, it tends to be a lot more praise oriented, where it's like, you're doing a good job. Hey, that's good. Like you don't expect the white belt to do well. So it's not like, no, you're doing that wrong. You're doing that wrong, doing that. That would demotivate someone who's just starting out. They need those early wins. And I think Tim Ferriss talked about this, and a guy I know who coached basketball players talks about this. Like you gotta have the early wins. But once you get to a high level, a high caliber, like the top people, you don't need to like, hey, good job. Nice. You showed up for class. It's like, here's what you can do better. Like it's constantly at that high level, they want the challenge. So it's more, I almost see it like this shifting balance between like praise, here's what you're doing well, you're amazing, keep up the great work. And okay, here's what you need to work on. Here's what's not so well. If you don't fix that, you know, you're going to get submitted. And so it's a little bit more challenging in what's not working well. Mm-hmm. So the top level athletes, they can still benefit from praise, but it's like, if anything, their egos could be too high. You need to like kind of keep it in check. Whereas
the motivation at that point is perfection and mastery. And so the goal is like intentionally seeking out any aspects of your game where you suck.
Yeah. So
that you can fix them.
Yeah. And they built up the confidence at that point. So once you have a certain level of achievement and habits, you've built up the belief in yourself where you kind of tolerate a little bit more of the someone challenging you, let's say negative feedback or constructive criticism. So a lot of what I'm doing, I'm kind of looking through the lens of like, what is an individual need, right? At this moment in time, like what's kind of universal, but what's also personally tailored to where a person's at. And that's that nuance. That's like, is this a deviation? Are they trying to just start a habit going? Are they regressing? Are they progressing? And so in order to maintain a balance, I would go back to, okay, what did I do well? It's always fine to acknowledge your successes. And then what can I do even better? Or, you know, what didn't work? So the person who goes, oh, I screwed up today, I binge ate or whatever, dwelling on what's already happened, there's nothing that's going to come from that other than looking at, where did I go wrong? Wait a second. What led to my binge eating? What was the cue for that? Let me decode that so that tomorrow I do something so it doesn't happen again. Mm-hmm. So going forward, I'm going to do better, right? What happens with the person who goes, screw it, which is a very common thing. You know, someone goes, which it's hard for me to understand that. That's one of the frustrating things that led me to research this, was like, oh, I'm following this diet plan and, you know, I had a couple drinks tonight and I didn't follow it and it's Friday. So you know what, I'll just start over again on Monday. I'm like, no, you just start, it's fine. Look, happened. Great. So like immediately you just get back on track. That's, I think, the difference in mentality. Mm-hmm. So I can give some practical tips of how to do that, but I'd say it really comes from this idea of the beating oneself up over the mistakes, it's okay to have some negative emotions around that. That can be useful, but then it's turning it into something practical. And again, it's that, how can I do better? What caused this? Let's identify what happened. And then now going forward, was I unprepared? How do I be prepared tomorrow? Was I around certain influences in my environment? If I'm serious about this, do I need to cut those people out or minimize my exposure? What is it that happened? And then now let's fix that going forward.
There was a third piece of this that I think I interrupted you before you got into. I don't know. Did you get to that, or?
So basically, yeah, like what worked,
Mm.
what could I do even better? Those are the two main things. So that's kind of the positive and the negative. And then the if, when, then planning is what the research shows is, if people just have a good intention, I'm going to start exercising this week. I think it's somewhere in the 30% range of people who actually follow through. It goes up to almost 80% if people are like, this is when I'm going to exercise. After work at 5:30, I'm going to drive to the gym. I'm going to do this plan. So they actually have an exact plan in mind for what they're going to do going forward. So if this happens or when this happens, then I will do blank. When the server hands me the menu and asks if I want dessert, then I'm going to order, I think one guy did like, I'm going to order a green tea, or I'm going to order whatever. So you're not caught off guard in those situations. You've actually thought about the obstacles or the challenges that are going to come up. And then you have a plan for it and mentally rehearsing it, so that those things act as a cue to do the thing that you do want to do, the positive behavior that's going to be healthier.
There was a section in your book that I really like, where you talk about growth mindset, and you wrote in the book, pairing a growth mindset with internal discipline is crucial. You also said it's time to recognize that having an easy life is a delusion laced with unmet dreams and complacency. So talk to me why we shouldn't necessarily desire an easy life, and why internal discipline and a growth mindset are so important.
First of all, this is a little bit of tough love. And the reason there's a little bit of tough love in this book is because it took me a really long time to get over the amount of death that I saw as a physician. Maybe some physicians are more robust than I am, but day after day of seeing individuals really struggling physically or at the end of life became very difficult for me. And I sat with them a lot, and I talked to them, and I listened to the things that they regretted doing and the way in which the last handful of years went for them. I don't want anyone to experience that. I don't want them to have regrets. People spend a lifetime trying to look for an easy way out, or struggling with the self-worthiness of having a strong physical body because they don't feel worthy. An individual will only go as high as their health worthiness is. And I've seen this over and over and over again. We shouldn't frame our life looking for a stress-free life. We should understand that challenges are not negative, and that challenges generate and cultivate capacity. And that capacity is a privilege. There is a narrative, again, I've mentioned to you before, that when we hear something enough, we believe it. And it doesn't mean it's true. And we hear over and over again how bad stress is, how stress is going to kill us and make our hair fall out and be gray, etc. But what if that's not true? And we have one word to define stress, and that includes the death of a loved one. My son peed on the wall. I spilled hot coffee over everything. I lost my job, or I have to go to the DMV with paperwork. We only have one word to describe a billion different things. And within that one word, we've also only really been taught about fight or flight versus tend and befriend, or the courage response, other more facilitating responses to stress that really create a depth to capacity. And that's what we have to understand, that I've never seen a stress-free life make massive impact. And at the end of the day, people want to leave a legacy, whether it's an outward legacy or an inward legacy or just a legacy of being to friends and loved ones. And you cannot do that if you are constantly trying to step away from stress. So you have to embrace it and reframe it and understand that it is a privilege.
But yeah, man, there's so many things that are just little hacks, right? And to include sleep. Gosh, like prioritizing sleep, best practices for sleep, massive. And I think one final one that I'll say before we move on is one of the reasons people fail is in their environment isn't set up in a conducive way to allow them to succeed. And our environment is probably one of the single biggest triggers for behavior. So if I'm sitting in my kitchen constantly, in my kitchen, I have this, or maybe I sit on my couch and I have this association in the couch with snacking. Well, as soon as I see that couch and I walk in the room, my brain wants to go back into that snacking mode, right? So the environment that we set up around us and the habits we create in those environments are massive. So one of the first things I work on with a lot of my clients is like, hey, what are those environmental triggers? What happened exactly before you cheated on your diet? What happened before you had those snacks you shouldn't have? And let's look at what those triggers are environmentally and remove them or use them as a signal to create a behavioral change. So if I see that, Ari, every time you walk into the kitchen and you open the pantry, your brain goes, cookies. I go, okay, awesome. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to, the next time you go to the pantry, you're going to open it, you're going to go, cookies. As soon as you feel that, right before you get the cookie, I'm not saying you can't have the cookie, but I want you to go on a 5 or a 10-minute walk, or I want you to do something that just adds a bit of a gap between the stimulus and the response. So we're trying to increase the gap, the time between that signal, which is opening the pantry and seeing the cookies, and you eating them. And eventually we can create enough of a gap that you forget to do it, or you're like, oh, I don't have to do that anymore. You've uncoupled that association. I think that's a really powerful tool for people who tend to overeat or tend to have some negative habit that they want to change, is you have to have some intervention there to create a gap.
You mentioned something as you were talking there about when you used to feel hungry, you used to smile and like get excited because that meant you're burning fat. I have a couple of comments on this. One, I've had the experience, I'm sure you've seen this too, of working with overweight people who, as they're starting to implement some strategies to lose weight, I've seen this happen a number of times where somebody will feel a burning sensation in their abdomen and get alarmed by it and actually like consider calling the doctor or going to the hospital or like, panic and freak out like something's wrong. And then they realize that it's just the sensation of hunger. They literally have not felt the sensation of hunger in years or sometimes decades. And there's a number of avenues we could probably go down just based on that topic alone. What are the consequences of never getting into that state? But the other thing I want to mention that's interesting here is you mentioned Andrew Huberman, and he talks about, as far as dopamine circuits, this idea of subjective insertion, where you take control of your own dopamine circuits and take something that maybe otherwise would not necessarily be something that makes you feel pleasure, like the discomfort of hunger pangs, for example, but you now create an association where you go, I'm going to smile because now this means I'm on the right track to achieve my goal. So you're training your brain that bit of discomfort is actually something that you should be happy about and turn it into pleasure. So anyway, those two comments I wanted to make, but please, I'm sure you got commentary, take that wherever you want to go.
So it's funny that Dr. Huberman and I bonded over that, because one of the things that I've perpetuated since my career was like, so I was known for my legs. I was known for having some of the best legs in the planet. And I took pride in crushing anyone that came in to train with me on leg day. And like, I would intentionally try to crush their soul. Like I wasn't always nice, but the way that I was able to do that was every time it was just so uncomfortable. It was almost unbearable. I would smile. And at the time I'm like, I know that I'm doing something that no one else can. So I get this almost devilish smile, right? And it was, I wasn't trying to put anyone down, but I was literally training myself to love that. And so I had this quote that says, at the deepest depths of your hardest hour, smile, knowing you're becoming a better version of yourself. And it's funny because when he heard me say it, he goes, man, that do you know what you're doing there? I go, no. And he goes, oh yeah, so you're hijacking the dopamine system. And I was like, gosh, that's so fascinating. So yeah, and all you have to do is just convince yourself or train yourself to realize like, this is a good thing. and it's certainly a far kind of divergence for most people, isn't it? And I often teach this in the gym, and I use this metaphor, like, think of us, maybe, I don't know, 50,000 years ago as humans, when the first, or whatever duration of time when we first discovered fire. When somebody first saw fire, let's say you saw a big fire off in the distance, you didn't know what it was. At first, you're going to go like, oh my gosh, it's a god, right? You're like, oh, it's this amazing thing. And eventually, the next day you come back, you go a little bit closer, you go, oh, it's a god, like amazing. I'm gonna bow to it. Eventually, you get closer and closer. You start to feel the heat, and you go, oh, I can't go any closer. Like you start to feel the warmth. But eventually you get a little more comfortable and you go back a little further, and eventually you're right up against it and you're waving your hand through it. And maybe you're going, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And then eventually you're able to cook your food in it, and you're able to heat your family, and you're able to sustain life. So it goes from being this thing that's like fearful and I'm like staying a distance, to eventually becoming the greatest asset in my life, right? So I'm walking into this fire, I'm going, man, I can cook my food, I can keep my family warm at night. I can use this for my tribe to be able to thrive and grow. Well, that's, I think, the same idea that exists in exercise. In the beginning, when people walk into the gym, like, oh, I don't like this. I hate it, right? And they're like, well, how about we just slowly, intentionally walk you a little bit closer, as close as you want. I'm not going to rush you, as close as you want into that proverbial fire. And if you feel it uncomfortable at like 6 reps, no problem. You stop right there. And next time, let's try 7. Maybe you could just even start the next rep and see if you can go a little bit further into that discomfort. And eventually you develop what I developed, which is like, when I go into the gym, the set starts when I start to get into the excruciating burn. I was like, oh yeah, here we go. This is what I'm looking for. This is the reward for me, right? So it's like you see the reward and you go into it because you're like, that's where the gold is, man. That's where the good stuff is. Rather than like typical people who walk in the gym, like, I don't even want to lift the weight because it really hurts. I'm like, yeah, it does. Stop. Don't go in it, right? And that perspective of like, it's okay to stop. I don't have to yell at you and tell you to do 10 more. I want you to be comfortable and realize you're safe. Right. This is an important lesson for parents too. As parents, sometimes, I'm sure you'll deal with this at some point. Kids can tend to have an aversion to discomfort. They're like riding their bike or going for a walk. This really hurts. I want to stop. Stop. No problem. You can decide how far you want to go. But I want you to realize next time, maybe you could go just a little bit further. Oh yeah, right. And now I'm empowering them rather than beating them down and go, you need to go further. Well, now they're a victim. They have to, rather than someone who makes the conscious choice to go, yeah, I did go a little further into it. And actually it didn't feel really good at the time, but now I realize like, yeah, I actually did better today than I did yesterday. And that's the paradigm.
I'm having to navigate a lot of that right now with my 4-year-old son, as teaching him to swim. And he's got a really intense fear of the water. Yeah. And so it's been a big challenge to get him to do this thing that he's so afraid of, and to learn how to push himself a little bit beyond where he was.
Dude, until you let him make that conscious decision himself, he'll always be a victim, because he'll always be like, I have to, rather than like, oh, I see that I'm going to be okay and I get to, right? So that little flip, this is what I teach all of my coaches. It's like, you have to curate the subjective experience of your client, right? So the subjective experience is, what are they perceiving in their brain? And you have to intentionally be aware of that, this high level, meta level awareness of like, I see what you're going through in your head, and I'm going to let you stop wherever you're comfortable. But I'm going to be aware of curating it and going further and further and further each time, to include like the subjective experience of, did I enjoy this? How do I feel or not? And progressing that in whatever way you can, is kind of a high level approach to helping anyone with behavior change.